Hello everyone. We are going to start reading chapter 2 today of Beezus and Ramona. Chapter 2, Beezus and Her Imagination. Beezus and Ramona both looked forward to Friday afternoons after school. Beezus because she attended the art class in the recreation center in Glenwood Park. Ramona because she was allowed to go to the park with Beezus and play in the sand pile until the class was over. This Friday, while Beezus held Ramona by the hand and waited for the traffic light to change from red to green, she thought how wonderful it would be to have an imagination like Ramona's. "Oh, you know, Ramona, her imagination runs away with her," Mother said when Ramona made up a story about seeing a fire engine crash into a garbage truck. "That child has an imagination a mile long." The Quimby's grown-up friends remarked when Ramona sat in the middle of the living room floor in a plastic wading pool she had dragged up from the basement and pretending she was in a boat in the middle of the lake. "Did you ever see so much imagination in such a little girl?" the neighbors asked one another when Ramona hopped around the yard pretending she was the Easter Bunny. One spring day, Ramona had got lost because she started out to find the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. The rainbow had appeared at the end of the park until she reached the park, but then it looked as if it ended behind the supermarket. When the police brought Ramona home, Father said, "Sometimes I think Ramona has too much imagination." Nobody reflected Beezus. Never says anything about my imagination. Nobody at all. And she wished more than anything that she had an imagination. How pleased Miss Robbins, the art teacher, would be with her if she had an imagination like Ramona's. Unfortunately, Beezus was not very good at painting. At least not the way Miss Robbins wanted boys and girls to paint. She wanted them to use their imagination to feel free. Beezus still squirmed with embarrassment when she thought of her first painting, a picture of a dog with Bow Wow coming out of her mouth in a balloon. Miss Robbins pointed out that only in the funny papers did dogs have bow coming out of their mouths in balloons. Bow in a balloon was not art. When Miss Robbins did think one of Beezus's paintings was good enough to put up on the wall, she always tacked it way down at the end, never in the center. Beezus wished she could have a painting in the center of the wall. "Hurry up, Ramona," Beezus coaxed. Then she noticed that her sister was dragging a string along behind her. "Oh, Ramona," she protested, "why do you have to bring Ralph with you?" Ralph was an imaginary green lizard Ramona liked to pretend she was leading by a string. I love Ralph," said Ramona firmly, "and Ralph loves to go to the park." Beezus knew it was easier to pretend along with Ramona than to make her stop. Anyway, it was better to have her pretend to lead a lizard than to pretend to be a lizard herself. "Can you carry him?" she suggested. "No," said Ramona. "He's slimy." When the girls came to the shopping district, Ramona had to stop at the drugstore scales and pretend to weigh herself while Beezus held Ralph's string. "I weigh 11 pounds, she announced, while Beezus smiled at Ramona's idea of her weight. "It just goes to show how much imagination Ramona has," she thought. At the radio and photograph store, Ramona insisted on petting his master's voice. The black and white plaster dog, bigger than Ramona, that always sat with one ear cocked in front of his door. Beezus thought admiringly about the amount of imagination it took to pretend that a scared and chipped plaster dog was real. If only she had that imagination like Ramona's, maybe Miss Robbins would say her paintings were free and were free and imaginative and would tack them on the middle of the wall. When they reached the park, Beezus left Ramona and Ralph at the sand pile, and feeling more and more discouraged at her own lack of imagination, hurried her to the recreation center. The class had already poured paints into their muffin tins and were painting on paper thumbtacked to drawing boards. The room hummed with activity. Ms. Robbins, wearing a gay paint-smeared smock, flew from one artist to another, praising, correcting, suggesting. Beezus waited until Ms. Robbins finished explaining to a boy that he should not outline a mouth with black paint. Her mouth wasn't outlined in black, was it? Then Beezus said, "I'm sorry, I'm late, Ms. Robbins." She stared at the fascination at Ms. Robbins' earrings. They came almost to her shoulders and were made of silver wire twisted and bent into interesting shapes. Not the shape of anything in particular, just interesting shapes. That's all right, Miss Robbins. Her earrings smiled at Beezus. Get your paints and paper. Today, everyone is painting an imaginary animal. An imaginary animal? Beezus repeated blankly. How could she possibly think of an imaginary animal? As Beezus poured paints into her muffin tin and tacked a sheet of paper to her drawing board, she tried to think of an imaginary animal, but all the animals she could think of, cats, dogs, cows, and horses, lions, and giraffes, were discouragingly real. Reluctantly, Beezus took the only vacant seat, which was beside a boy named Wayne, who came to class only because his mother made him. Once Beezus had hung her sweater on the back of the chair, and Wayne had printed "Post no bills" on it in chalk. Beezus had worn it all the way home before she discovered it. Since then, she did not care to sit beside Wayne. Today, she noticed he had parked a grape-flavored lollipop on a paper towel beside his muffin tin of paints. Eesh. "Hi, Bees," he greeted her. "No fair licking my sucker." "I don't want your old sucker," answered Beezus. "And don't call me Bees." "Okay, Bees," said Wayne. At the moment the door opened and Ramona walked into the room. She was still dragging the string behind her and she looked angry. "Why, hello," said Miss Robbins pleasantly. "Oh, Ramona, you're supposed to be playing in the sand pile," said Beezus, going over to her. "No," said Ramona flatly. "Howie threw sand on Ralph." Her dark eyes were busy taking in paints, the brushes and drawing board. Her dark eyes were busy taking in paints, the brushes, the drawing boards. "I'm going to paint," she announced. "Mother said you were supposed to play in the sand pile," protested Beezus. "You're too little for this class." "You say that about everything," complained Ramona. Then she turned to Miss Robbins. "Don't step on Ralph," she said. "Ralph is a make-believe green lizard. She pretends she leads around on string." Beezus was embarrassed at having to explain such a silly thing. Miss Robbins laughed. "Ha ha! Well, here is a little girl with lots of imagination. How would you like to paint a picture of Ralph for us, Ramona?" Beezus could not help feeling annoyed. Miss Robbins was letting Ramona stay in the class, the one place where she was never allowed to tag along. Miss Robbins would probably like her painting because it was so full of imagination. Ramona's pictures, in fact, were so full of imagination that it would even more imagination to tell what they were. Ramona beamed at Miss Robbins, who found a drawing board for her and a stool, which she placed between Beezus and Wayne. She lifted Ramona onto the stool. "There, now you can share your sister's paints," she said. Ramona looked impressed at being allowed to paint with such big boys and girls. She sat quietly on her stool, watching everything around her. Maybe she'll behave herself after all, thought Beezus as she dipped her brush into blue paint, and now I don't have to sit next to Wayne. Since Beezus still had not thought of any imagination animal, she decided to start with the sky. Do the sky first, Beezus whispered to Ramona, who looked as if she did not know how to begin. Then Beezus faced her own work, determined to free and imaginative, to be free on a piece of paper that was not free on a piece of paper was not easy as it sounded, she thought. Ms. Robbins always said to start with the big areas of the picture and paint them bravely and boldly. So Beezus spread the sky on her paper with brave and bold strokes. Back and forth across the paper she swept her brush, brave and bold and free. That was the way to do it. All right, we'll continue there in the next video.